Go.
Hello, and welcome to the Glasgow University History Society's own podcast, our way of making ourselves slightly less insane during the quarantine. You've got me, Robbie Patterson, you've got John Hill, and you've got Nathan McLennan as your host, taking you through Chernobyl.
Oh yes, Chernobyl, a cheery wee topic for this lovely time of year. So, on the 26th of April in 1986, at 23 minutes past 1, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant overheated. The resulting disaster brought the world to the brink of an environmental catastrophe the likes of which it has not seen before or since. And the aftermath saw the evacuation of 68,000 people and the deaths of hundreds due to radiation sickness. To this day, there's still a sizable exclusion zone, a great deal of which is affecting the small nations of Ukraine and Belarus. And the city of Pripyat has become arguably the most famous ghost town in the world. And within 5 years of the disaster, the Soviet Union, the greatest territorial empire of the 20th century, the last territorial empire in history, had collapsed. And the last leader of that empire, one Mikhail Gorbachev, said that if he could blame one single event above any other for the fall of the Soviet Union, he would blame Chernobyl. Soviet government's response to the disaster shook public confidence in the regime, and the aftermath exposed the serious structural flaws in the Soviet economy and the Soviet system of government. So, for the next half an hour, we're going to look at the disaster and we're going to look at the implications it had in shaping the continent that we live in today. Let's get started. So, question number 1, just thought we'd start off. How would we assess the Soviet government's response to Chernobyl? What do you think, guys?
It was pretty poorly done. It was pretty poorly handled and quite well covered up by the Soviet government, but it was quite poorly handled. The document I was looking at, sort of a declassified CIA document that you can find on the CIA reading room, it's called The Chernobyl Accident, the Social and Political Implications. They often talked about how the initial government response from Gorbachev was to remain silent, just keep stum until I believe it was 3 weeks after the incident, whereupon I'm pretty sure the precise date was sometime in May, early May, and he came out and then essentially shifted all the blame onto local officials. But the actual response itself doesn't appear to have been very well put together.
Indeed. John, what are you thinking?
I think it was the World Health Organization that claimed there was 4,000 deaths related to radiation exposure. And I think that there was one account that was quite interesting that struck with me quite a lot. It was a woman that lived there at the time, and she said that after the explosion, that they were aware that there were fires and firefighters were there trying to put it out and trying to contain as much as they could as firefighters the radioactive exposure. And she brought her child to school, and it was just a normal business as usual the next day. And there was no word in the papers or from any sort of government source to flee or to leave. So yeah, it's quite. They're very silent about it for certain.
Yeah, it was very sort of cover-up style. That was the sort of the Soviet Union's way of doing things, which is very ironic because it contrasts quite heavily with Gorbachev's idea of glasnost, which is openness in the Soviet media, rather than just keeping everything sort of bunched in to deal with in the party. I think what the thing I've been reading says is that they believe the undermining of the Soviet government came by and large from this sort of enhanced secrecy. Everyone knew that something had gone down at Chernobyl, but no one really knew how, and there wasn't much dissemination of public safety information. It sort of eroded confidence in the government by and large, just because they were very silent about that something terrible had happened. And the initial reports just said it's just a fire at the power plant, stuff where it's an ordinary reactor failure, whereas in actual fact it was 2 catastrophic explosions that was the result of incompetence rather than just a regular reactor failure.
Yes, and there seemed to be a certain culture of denialism even within the emergency workers. East Germany was building a robot specifically designed to extract the graphite from the roofs of buildings in Pripyat. And obviously the graphite was very, very radioactive, and potentially it could have been lethal for most of the surrounding environmental area. So they asked the Soviet scientists who were working on the case, what is the level of radiation that the graphite is emitting? Because they needed to build the robot within the certain tensions that it could deal with. And the Soviet scientists were told to deliberately underreport the levels of radiation that were being emitted, basically so the government can say, it's not as bad as you think. So subsequently, the German scientists built the robot to those specifications. The robot turned up to do its job and promptly melted within about 5 minutes. So, there you go.
Yeah.
That's how we do it. That's how we do it.
The only way they could deal with it is they had to send men from the Soviet army to go in and remove the graphite in intervals of 2 or 3 minutes at a time, because if they were there for any longer than that, they would receive a lethal dose of radiation. So if you think about it, the way they dealt with the cleanup afterwards was almost comical in how farcical the response was, and the number of lives it cost actually makes it quite disturbing if you think about it.
Absolutely. Initially, there was just the first responders, just firefighters who are basically going out to put this ordinary, what seems to be like an ordinary reactor fire out. But in actual fact, they're all being exposed to this lethal dose of radiation just by turning up to fire in the hoses. And the first group onto the roof actually did end up dying of radiation poisoning, helping to put out the reactor fire, or at least the initial impact of it, which is pretty bloody catastrophic. And again, I think it was you, John, you said that people were just going about their average day in Pripyat. Yeah, that's because there was no official government response till a few days later. They didn't. No public safety information was disseminated to the population as a whole. One of the really abysmal things, actually, is in Kiev, the May Day parade went ahead, despite party officials at that point trying to sort of get people out of the area and get their families away to safety. They encouraged people to go out with their kids into the May Day parade, whilst winds were blowing south from Chernobyl into Kiev, which would enhance everyone's exposure to radiation and generally cause them a lot of problems. So the Soviet government was just sort of adopting this business as usual policy to deal with this catastrophic reactor destruction, and just letting it sort of simmer over in the population, just a sort of, don't worry about it, comrade, it's all going to be fine. Just, it wasn't. It absolutely wasn't.
That's putting it mildly. So, do we agree with Mikhail Gorbachev in his assessment of the disaster that his government handled? Do we think that, above all else, signalled the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union?
I think there was a lot more factors than Chernobyl itself, though it being a key factor that perhaps did contribute in precipitating its decline. I think there are many other factors, like Gorbachev's reforms, for example. I think this strikes me as a rather major point for the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fact that he relaxed laws on religion, free speech, he aimed to make the USSR into a similar state to China, where it's like reduces the communism in the state, so it becomes a communist capitalist hybrid, and I think that led to government criticism with all these reforms. So I think that was one of the major points, in my opinion.
Yeah, the move away from sort of orthodox communism to a sort of hybrid system where the political power is still monopolized by the party, but exactly. The economic stuff sort of disseminated a wee bit more into...
Yeah, because as we know, under Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky in the early days, the USSR was under strict Marxist ideological values. It was all about the party, and by the 1960s and 70s, we obviously see a rise in the political elite of the USSR, dining well, living life quite well, and in relative luxury, whereas the average person, the average Joe, they're just dying of starvation or waiting in bread lines. Yeah.
It's quite a disturbing image to see mirrored, even in the modern day, just like vast numbers of people waiting to bread lines. If you think how ubiquitous it was back then, it is very bloody grim to think of, especially with the contrast of the higher-ups of the Soviet government enjoying relative luxury.
And if you think about it in the context of right now the crisis we're going in at the moment, we're seeing our own government trying, and with some mixed success, to deal with what is a major public health crisis, much like the Soviet Union did with Chernobyl. And in both cases, you've got a lot of people in the ordinary populace who are understandably quite concerned, a bit scared. Emotions run high, and bitterness, especially over what's perceived to be government irresponsibility or government failure, tends to persist in a quite strong way. So if you think about it, well, certainly Chernobyl wasn't the only factor towards the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was more a symptom of the disease than the cause of the disease itself.
Yeah, and a symptom that was made very horribly available to both the international community and the Soviet public. When the report on the Chernobyl disaster was commissioned by the Soviet Union, they actually hid the report they sent to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which was widely disseminated across Europe, just how badly this reactor had fucked up and how it was subpar construction in the first place that led to the Chernobyl disaster, partly due to low workplace morale, lack of equipment, lack of professional labour. And they covered this up inside the Soviet Union itself. The report wasn't widely disseminated, if at all. So they were really trying to keep their population in the dark about everything that could have possibly gone wrong with the Soviet Union. There was a massive propaganda push just after the Chernobyl disaster that claimed that the sort of reports in the West about the disaster were an attempt to undermine the Soviet Union, sort of a cloud of anti-Sovietism rather than the actual nuclear cloud that was covering Belarus and Ukraine, which it shows that the Soviet Union was mostly concerned with the power and maintenance of the Soviet Union rather than the people underneath it. They want to maintain this idea of superiority, and even though they're critically undermining their people in the process by failing to correctly disseminate information throughout them to avoid things like social panic and to just cement their control.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think Chernobyl is an incident in the context of the end of the Soviet Union. It was a precipitating incident to its decline. It did contribute, but even before then, the Soviet Union was at the beginning of its end, with the Soviet-Afghan war, as we mentioned just before the video, and its creation of a facade of the Soviet Union as existing as a powerhouse still as it was in the 1950s. The aesthetic perception of the Soviet Union was very misleading on the world stage, and I think it's their poor reaction to Chernobyl is what their attempts to preserve this facade, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they sort of want to make sure that everyone knows everything's all right, but at the same time, it's falling apart at the seams in many ways.
Certainly, yeah. What do you think, Nathan?
I would agree with that. I think we need to look at the context of the last 20 years of Soviet history up to 1986. You've got 20 years of a mostly stagnant economy, 20 years of static wages, 20 years of an increasingly inefficient industrial output. So you've got more or less got a society that's in terminal decline. And that's reflected in the attitude of the population. Increasingly, they're getting more fed up with their government. The government does try and lean on to Soviet patriotism, like the kind that was seen during the Second World War. But that increasingly is less effective. Soviet populace is less engaged in the Cold War against the United States' struggle to achieve socialism, and more disillusioned. So they were already a mostly disengaged and apathetic populace by the time that Chernobyl occurred. Then after Chernobyl, they had now shifted from being disillusioned with their government to actively opposed to their government, mostly on the basis that their government couldn't deal with one of the most fundamental things that a government must do, which is to preserve the welfare of its citizens. I mean, that's the fundamental issue. It wasn't long afterwards that the Berlin Wall came down, which obviously isn't related to Chernobyl, but it showed which way the wind was blowing, to quote a very famous song by the Scorpions.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. That all very much makes sense, especially considering it just did undermine the population's faith in the government completely, even though it was already going through this massive social decline.
And here's something I thought we could talk about. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Chinese government spent a decade or more engaged in post-Soviet studies, more or less to figure out what went wrong. So in that vein, I thought we should think, how can Chernobyl inform our own responses to crises? And you can answer with or without reference to the one we're going through right now.
John, if you'd like to.
I think we need to understand how far government intervention is necessary, certainly. In a crisis like that, with Chernobyl, it is obviously necessary. And I think, how far they're willing to go in, it depends what your agenda is as a government, isn't it, really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was thinking, in relation to a disaster, I remember when I was quite young, Hurricane Katrina in the United States. Obviously, it was the international community widely remarked it was not very well responded to by the American government. And actually, if you look at the response in the aftermath of Katrina, the American government tended to make things worse, or at the very least, didn't improve things. Most of what was achieved in response to the crisis was done either by private businesses or by localized state-specific agencies on the ground. And it leads me to reflect that actually, when dealing with a crisis of this proportion, decentralization of the response is actually better. And if we look at Chernobyl, obviously centralization was what the Soviet Union was all about. I mean, literally everything in society was part of a interconnected bureaucracy linked to the communist government. And that is probably the worst setup you can have to effectively and efficiently deal with a crisis with a rapidly developing situation. Which, again, the Americans learned to their cost 20 years later in Katrina, and in some respects, some countries are learning it to their cost today.
It was also pretty damn ingenious how Gorbachev managed to deflect the flak from him and his own political program, even though the crisis was ongoing. He basically blamed the local authorities for failing to do enough to contain the disaster and blamed the plant operators, and just completely detached himself from the initial disaster response. Came out a while later talking about how this exemplified the failures in the Soviet Union, why we need reform. He harnessed it, even though it was a catalyst for the fall of the Soviet Union. He also tried to use it as a catalyst for his own political reforms and capitalized on the current crisis to sort of push the perestroika and glasnost agenda, which ironically did end up weakening the Union further because it was largely held together through fear. In many ways, fear of what the government could do to you if you stepped out of line. And when they sort of relaxed the iron grip a little, things sort of fell back a bit. It goes back to a quote. I think it was Metternich. I might be wrong, but I think it was Chancellor Metternich of Austria who said you could do many things with a bayonet except sit on it. So if you're going to, I've not one to try. If you're going to create this sort of authoritarian regime that's built largely around fear, you can't let up once you've started on that precedent. And in the modern day, I think that means we have to be very careful in instituting authoritarian policies, because they can, once you do relax the grip a little, people will take the inch you've given them for a mile, and then the system can all very easily unwind. And also we need to watch out for people capitalizing on crises in a political manner.
Oh, yes. The one thing I've learned about authoritarian regimes is that every authoritarian regime at its heart is unstable. Every authoritarian regime is always teetering on the edge of a new crisis. And every authoritarian regime is facing its end literally every year and trying hard to keep itself going. That's the nature of being an authoritarian ruler. It's why so many authoritarian regimes don't last. I mean, the Soviet Union is quite rare in how long it managed to carry on for.
It is a sort of a very unique example of sustained authoritarian rule, especially in the modern world when there were so many alternatives to that policy of rulership.
Interestingly, the only country that is on course to beat the Soviet Union right now is China, which will outbreak the Soviet Union's record if it makes it to 2023, which may or may not happen, who knows.
When it comes to Gorbachev's responses, even though he did sort of harness it as a catalyst to try and reform the Soviet system, it just didn't work. So people do become aware that the sort of internal structure of these regimes, once they're so flawed, sometimes they do just have to be discarded.
Oh, yes. And it's really down to the skill of the politicians at the end of a regime, whether or not they can make something new out of it. Unfortunately, Gorbachev couldn't, which is why he's remembered as one of Europe's failed leaders. Although, if you look at what he was actually trying to do, there was potential in what he was doing. There was great potential in what he might have turned the Soviet Union into. A sort of social democratic alternative to the European Union, which potentially could have solved a number of problems. But he didn't have the skill to pull it off, so Russia ended up in its oligarchical era and then eventually into the hands of Putin, for good and for ill.
On the point of sort of the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union, I suppose you could argue that it wasn't going to fall until right before it did, because there was a referendum held in the later years of the Soviet Union. I think it was the only democratic referendum in the history of the Soviet Union, though I might stand wrong on that. But the vast majority of people actually voted to keep the Soviet Union in place, and it was the coup, I believe it was the August coup under Yeltsin in the Russian Federation, that sort of led to the final demise of the Soviet Union, because it swept Russia itself out from under it. So sorry.
As odd as we may find it, people did think of the Soviet Union as their country. There was still a certain sense of pride in the achievements that the Soviet Union had managed. And then people are reluctant to see what they think of as their country disappear, regardless of the myriad problems it may have.
And I think with the imminent decline of the Soviet Union, I think the complete opposite of that was a contribution to its decline. So in the 1998 nationalist movements, with the 15 republics that served as its sort of buffer zone with Europe and further south, I think they're pulling away from this centralized system based in Moscow, as you said, Nathan. I think that their loss of the iron grip over them contributed to this nationalism and this nationalistic attempts at moving away. And I think that also, that's my thought on that.
It is odd, though, just how quickly it went. I mean, the Soviet Union dominated political thought in the 20th century, and within a few years it went from being a superpower to non-existent. And I think in a way a lot of the last 30 years or so has been the West trying to deal with not having an ideological enemy to deal with anymore, and not really having much of a purpose anymore, if you think about it. The European Union used the opportunity to expand massively, and perhaps it expanded too far and lost track of what it was supposed to be. The Americans certainly lost track of what they were supposed to be doing. Ended up in quite a fair bit of trouble by the time the Bush era turned around. So, in a way, the demise of the Soviet Union was probably the worst thing that happened to the West in many ways.
Yeah, sort of the loss of one cohesive opponent that served as a factor for not just national unity, but international unity and the construction of international movements, like, for example, NATO, was just lost and cast adrift.
I think another important factor with the decline, as well as Chernobyl, I think we've mentioned the United States, obviously, a few times since the Cold War, but I think Ronald Reagan and his administration himself is another seriously major factor in its decline, because in the 1980s we see the proliferation of technology, and was it the Star Wars program in the late 80s, which obviously created like unparalleled supremacy in the arms race. And I think at this time, the USSR couldn't match that. It had fingers in pies across the world, in Afghanistan, in the 15 buffer republics, and it just couldn't keep up.
I think, like most fallen empires, there was a certain sense that history had overtaken the Soviet Union at a certain point. probably at some point in the Brezhnev era, that was the moment of no return.
Aye,
In fact, I'd argue that the removal of Nikita Khrushchev is probably the last opportunity the Soviets had in order to come out of the Cold War more or less on top. Everything after that was just a very, very slow decline into a disaster. But, you know, it even served the Americans' interest to inflate the danger the Soviet Union caused. Think by as early as the Kennedy administration, the Americans knew they had something in the region of 3 to 5 times as many nuclear warheads as the Soviet Union did, considerably larger army, considerably larger military coverage, more or less unparalleled supremacy. And yet they never released that to the public. They never mentioned it because it served their interests better for if people still thought the Soviet Union was a credible threat.
This sort of like nebulous big, as Reagan said, the evil empire off in the east that would serve as sort of a rallying cry for America's own national unity that sort of has seeped quite considerably since the end of the Soviet Union.
I think Reagan's his administration sort of managed to isolate the USSR from the world economy in a way. This made the Soviet economy severely weakened, and I think, it wouldn't have been able to match it. And this sort of economic weakening of the Soviet Union and economic isolation in the international economy leads Gorbachev's reforms to create this, what Nathan called a socialist alternative to the European Union, and their own advancement into communism into a hybrid capitalist system, which is a lot like China's, as you said, Robbie. It was like a last effort against the US in the Cold War.
And it didn't really go as planned in the end.
Definitely not. Yeah, definitely not. Especially with incidents like Chernobyl undermining this, and as you said, Gorbachev having to politicize it and change it into something that is nothing to do with his political program, which is very interesting.
It was sort of a way of just trying to focus the energies of the people in a completely different direction than what they were going, which was largely towards the nationalist movements in many cases.
Yeah, definitely.
It's been interesting as well to look at the effect that this end of the Soviet Union had even within Western states. Prior to the 1990s, most countries in the West had usually 2 main political parties, a centre-right party and a centre-left party. But even after the end of socialism, I suppose, the end of the Cold War, a lot of the centre-left parties, they either collapsed entirely or they were forced to change their programme so radically they no longer resembled what they were in the past. I mean, in Britain it happened with the Labour Party. Italy had a fairly sizable and mainstream communist party that dominated politics for 50 years that disappeared almost overnight. France, their socialist party, again, it changed radically. German Social Democrats have never been a serious political force in the country since then. So really, in a way, it discredited left-wing politics as a whole, the end of the Soviet Union, for a good long while, and it forced Western countries in a radically different direction legislatively. And you can argue we're still on that direction even today. We're still thinking within those terms. Again, for good and for bad.
I can definitely agree with that, Nathan. Like, every time you bring up sort of, if you're ever having a political debate in a pub, which is sometimes probably going to get me thrown out of a pub.
Well, I should think so.
Alright, but usually if you do bring up like significant left-wing movements, like, people are very quick to cry commie, and especially in America, it seems to be viewed as this sort of almost, we triumphed over this exact thing. It proves that your ideas doesn't work. Now let's get on with whatever we wanted. It sort of it detracts from overall political debate, the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, in a way, I suppose it has. Also, in a way, I think the ideas that were espoused by Marx have certain values and obviously are flawed in many ways. But the ideals in particular espoused by Lenin and Stalin, I think comprehensively have been disproven. The idea of the party as a vanguard obviously doesn't work because that always leads to monopolization and dictatorship, it always has done. The idea of a very, very large and intrusive state, I think most people today wouldn't see that as a credible alternative to the kind of economics we have now, and most people look at the Soviet Union as it's almost as alien a way of life to us now as a medieval state would be. It's a completely different way of perceiving the world that most people just instinctively today, partly due to socialization, partly due to free thought, just don't agree with. Again, I'm kind of lukewarm on the issue, but I think that's just the direction that we've gone in the last 30 years, and the fall of the Soviet Union is kind of the last word on that particular way of organizing things.
It's an interesting comparison you make to medieval states and how sort of the alienation between sort of modern Western society and Soviet societies like that. Because I've been doing a wee bit of medieval reading lately, and it was pretty bloody horrific to just see what people would have viewed as average at one point. There was a petition to the Count of Barcelona from, I think it was either banal lords or local sort of sub-county figures who are requesting the right to maltreat the peasantry or the local population as part of their ability to gain more wealth. And then you'll obviously look over to the Soviet Union and see very much the opposite of that, which is the people like maltreating those who are in power or were in power during the Tsarist regime because of that precise sort of lack of good care that was forced onto them, the sort of terrible conditions that poor people were forced to endure. And it would be a bit premature to say we've struck a balance in the modern West, but we've certainly made an improvement over either sort of feudal organization or outright sort of national control over everything, sort of complete nationalization of resources.
Yeah, so I think the quote, "the past is another country," has never been more appropriate when talking about the Soviet Union.
Yeah. I think if we're talking a final point on the decline of the Soviet Empire, contentious term, but yeah, if we're talking about the decline, I think if we return back to Soviet-Afghan war, I think in a way, after looking at it a bit, it feels like it's Russia's Vietnam. It's against the Islamic tribal warlords in the Afghan mountains. I think it's another. Chernobyl is like this in that it's an incident that contributes to its decline. It's like it has a little effect, but all of these incidents are adding up to create this implosion.
Yeah, in a way, the Soviet economy was already on the downturn when they went into Afghanistan, and the war just was a massive drain on resources.
Exactly.
In America, they were able to weather the worst effects of Vietnam because they were the largest economy in the world. They had a very, very vibrant economy in the 50s and 60s. So they didn't really notice, obviously, that human cost of the war was quite devastating for many Americans. In Russia, they didn't even have the comfort of the massive material excesses to deal with it. So Afghanistan was very, very demoralizing for the Soviet psyche, and very, very frustrating for the Soviet leadership.
Yeah, it was also a sort of final USSR intervention in world affairs, just like America during the Cold War, sticking its fingers into each country and trying to contain communism. It's just the Soviets' final attempt at making its international presence seen and effective, but obviously they truly did fail against these warlords and in being able to pacify the anarchy and the uncontrollable socialist president Armin.
And it's appropriate that the seeds of the Soviet Union's destruction was in a region that the West itself has struggled to deal with considerably since the end of the Soviet Union. In a way, it was the wheel of history turning itself into what would be the defining struggle of the new era of world politics. which up until now has been defined quite strongly by the struggle of Western powers against external threats, terrorists, basically.
Which are in and of themselves very, very nebulous, whereas the Soviet Union was this just massive didactic force that the West could rally against. Now there's a lot of disparate little movements that people argue constitute national threats, and in some cases they definitely do, but there's definitely nothing on the scale of opposition that there was with the Soviet Union. Because even with nations like China, they're not necessarily, they are in some ways ideologically opposed, but in terms of economics, they operate in a rather capitalist economy, even though they are an authoritarian state.
Oh yes, capitalism is the way the world works now. Nobody seriously challenges that. And again, terrorists, unlike the Soviet Union claimed to have an alternative way for people to live. That their society was the future. Goes back to Khrushchev's point about burying the West in history. And once that failed, nobody has ever seriously challenged the Western way of living and organising yourself. Obviously, there have been many forces that militarily challenged Western countries, but none of them have offered any kind of serious alternative the way the Soviet Union tried to. So in a way, the West, due to a combination of overconfidence and eventually a certain amount of apathy, again finds itself missing the challenge. It misses the World War II spirit in a way, the notion of a collective struggle against a threat. And in a way, I think some people, certainly higher ups, are looking to find a way to recreate that.
Yeah, a common enemy really does bolster support for certain values in a country, doesn't it? Yeah.
It does.
It really does.
And alliances, obviously.
There has been large-scale questioning of keeping with Cold War relics, as it were, like NATO, which was essentially designed to protect from Soviet encroachment in Europe, but now has lost even that, because there is no real large-scale threat of military conflict in the modern world anymore. You will get proxy wars in contested regions, but by and large, the West seems at the moment to be pretty secure, which does warrant the questioning of why people do keep with Cold War institutions, and nations do keep with Cold War institutions that have arguably run their course.
And in a way, there's always the fear that something new will come at people, but thinking that Putin's Russia might at some point find itself in a position to be able to challenge the West the way the USSR did. People are thinking that China might be the next new threat. Some people even think that emerging countries like India or Brazil might eventually be the next big threat. Obviously, I would rather live in a world where there was no big threat and we could all just sort of cooperate with our own spheres of influence. But then again, in some ways, people do respond well to threats. Human beings respond very well and work very well under the pressure, and especially under an existential threat, they work twice as hard. I mean, there was a quote, there was an article by, I don't remember the name of the person, but they were talking about the current crisis, and basically it says, every crisis pushes the fast forward button in history. So as a society is faced with a challenge, things that would have taken years to get through get pushed forward in days. I mean, we're doing it right now. Tried to deal with the corona crisis, World War II, decades of military and economic and social organisation change in the few years of struggle against Nazi Germany. And in a way, in the West, we haven't had anything like that. We've had no excuse to do that for a very long time.
Until we've now found our ways of life being very radically changed in the course of the current crisis, which is sort of, in a way, a sort of virus is the perfect sort of nebulous threat because you can't see it. It's very difficult to directly attack until you have the research behind you, which we don't as of yet. And so can engender a large-scale revision of what happens in day-to-day life. And that can be harnessed by the government to increase productivity or to do as Gorbachev did and sort of promote political platforms. Public health crises, by and large, seem to sort of lead to governments trying to push their own agenda by using the crisis. And that is probably one of the most dangerous things about them. It may not be the crisis in and of itself, because even though it will be terrible, things like World War II, things like the influenza pandemic, these things are undoubtedly terrible at the time. Massive national crises that require a huge amount of effort. But after that, the social impact can be pretty bloody devastating on the society as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh well, I think this particular podcast has run its course. We've thoroughly examined the tragic in some ways, not tragic in others, the demise of the Soviet Union. So what will we be doing next time?
I'd like to have a look at the Levelers in the English Civil War.
That's interesting. Okay, yeah, I like
because
that.
they were fantastic. I love the Levelers to bits.
We could do something about the Civil War era in general.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
sort of.
Yeah, I'm up for that. English
Just
Civil
like
War
we did
stuff.
with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and Chernobyl, so we could hone in on the levelers and then broaden it with the Civil War itself.
Yeah, that's a damn good idea. I'm up for that.
Yeah.
Well, next week it is Crown, Covenant, and Cromwell. The Civil Wars.
I like it. Very good.
Very good titling indeed. Tune in next time on the Glasgow University History Society podcast. Until then, I have been Robbie Patterson.
I'm John Hill.
And I have been Nathan McLennan.
See you next week, folks.
See you next week.